Welcome to Mount Pleasant Square, which is one of the finest examples of early 19th century housing in Dublin. The houses in the square were constructed between 1800 and 1830, putting them firmly within the late Georgian period. The houses are built in the Georgian tradition, where individual focus on houses is overseen by the greater composition of the terraces. So individual houses are not so important, but the composition of the overall is what gives Mount Pleasant Square its architectural quality. So the houses on Old Mount Pleasant were earlier than Mount Pleasant Square, and they date from the last decades of the 18th century. I think the earliest house there, number 6, dates from about 1780 or so. One of the most interesting residents in Old Mount Pleasant was a local champion, Deirdre Kelly, the late Deirdre Kelly, who wrote the definitive book about the history of this area, which is called The Four Roads to Dublin. Deirdre was a champion for the city and one of the people involved in protesting against the development of a petrol station on the Mount Pleasant site in the 1960s, of which you will hear more later. Mount Pleasant Square itself consists of 56 houses, which are laid out on 3 sides of a central space, so not a square at all, but actually 2 crescents, north and south, and a straight terrace on the western side. One of the features about Mount Pleasant Square that's particularly interesting is that it was largely laid out and developed by a single developer, and that is unusual in the Georgian tradition, certainly not the case in the Dublin city houses. That developer was a man called Terence Dolan. He was a glove maker and was from Church Street in the city. And he bought land in 3 separate transactions to build Mount Pleasant Square. So that was in 1805, 1807 and 1812. The first 8 houses in the square, which you can see are, take you up to this taller house here, they were built by a man called Solomon Williams, and he, I suppose, started the layout of the square when he built the beginning of this crescent on the south side. Why did he build a crescent? Well, the question is out there, I suppose, but he would have been familiar probably with Beresford Place and maybe Marino Crescent, which were built in the 1790s. And he is described in deeds as being from the city of Chester. So he may have had wider architectural influences. For example, in Chester and in Bath and Bristol, the idea of building a crescent in the countryside overlooking the city on a hill would have been known to him. So we think that that's why he started the crescent. But he didn't own the land on the other side of the square when he started that, so whether the final format, I suppose, of the square really was dependent on Terence Dolan. Terence Dolan was an amateur developer, and he bought and started building on this side of the square, the South Crescent, which is what it was called then. And he continued then building all of this side, completed by about 1811, and then he switched over to the other side of the square, the North Crescent, because at that stage he had bought the land on the other side of what was the Swan River Valley, and he built the North Crescent, and then he finished with the west side, which is the shortest side, I suppose, in that it backs onto the half-mile lane, which is now Mount Pleasant Avenue. One of the important features of the Mount Pleasant site is, of course, the Swan River, which is within the Central Park here. It flows from Rathmines towards Bowles Bridge, running straight through the centre of the square. And when you look into the square, the central space, you can see that it is in fact a river valley and slopes down quite dramatically. That Swan River was put in culvert by about 1860. So by the time that the square was complete and they were working on the central space and turning it into the pleasure garden that it was, the Swan was in culvert and nowadays is incorporated into the Rathmines and Pembroke drainage scheme. The central space was landscaped, and there are some of the early Ordnance Survey maps show the landscaping layout. It looked quite like Mountjoy Square with a big central green area and paths around it and tree planting. So we know that it was complete by the time of the 1866 Ordnance Survey map, but probably a little bit earlier. The new residents of the square, and the houses were all leased, they weren't sold, they were retained by Mr. Dolan. They paid key money until as late as 1947, I think some residents were still paying key money for the use of the public space. And you have to realise these houses have no front gardens, they have rear gardens, but the public recreational space to the front was a key ingredient of the Georgian tradition and what makes Mount Pleasant so special.
I'm Colin Murray, I'm the chairman of the Residents Association, and I lived here since the year 2000. And the Residents Association has been around for decades now, and we deal with all the normal stuff that residents associations deal with. But I think the bigger picture is that we are custodians of these wonderful Georgian buildings, and as such it's incumbent upon us to ensure that they are maintained in the correct Georgian tradition. So since I've moved into the square over 20 years ago, I'd say upwards of 40 of the houses have been completely restored. Previously they were in flats and weren't in great condition, but because they're protected structures, it means they've been restored correctly in the Georgian tradition. It's incumbent upon us as the owners and the custodians of these wonderful houses to ensure that any future developments or work are done correctly within the correct Georgian tradition. And restoring a house like these isn't as daunting a task as people may make out. There's lots of information and experts out there that can help you. There's restoration architects and lots of guidelines from various bodies that can help you. And of course they are BER exempt, so that's not a huge issue as well for people. The key thing is for people to just take the correct guidance and take the time with it, and that way these beautiful buildings can be maintained and upkept in the proper Georgian manner.
This is the Dolan family house, number 31 Mount Pleasant Square. And like a lot of developers, the biggest and best house built for himself. This is a 4-storey house over basement, and it's as big as a Georgian townhouse in the city. Terence Dolan, who developed the square, retained most of the houses himself and leased them on short leases to the residents. And an average rent, for example, in 1810 or 1811 was about £40 for the year. His family house was lived in by his son, Terence T. Dolan, and he was a solicitor with offices in Dame Street, and he was also one of the founding members of the Rathmines township when it was established in 1847. With Frederick Stokes and Frederick Jackson, the three of them really were the founding commissioners for the Rathmines township, and both Stokes and Dolan were property developers, so they had a particular interest in trying to establish the township to get away from the high rates that the city were charging. So they felt that if they could lower the rates, that they could attract development in the Rathmines and Ranelagh area. Terence T. Dolan's son, Henry, was also lived here at this house, and he was the first president of the Mount Pleasant Lawn Tennis Club, which was founded in 1893. The central space had been used as a tennis playing area, but not divided up and not formalised as a club until that date. Number 31 has a carriage archway which leads through to Mount Pleasant Avenue and to Richmond Avenue, linking straight through to Rathmines Road. The Swan River comes through this archway and runs across the road and through the centre of the square. When you walk around the square, it is really obvious that there are a lot of different house types as part of this development. And they range from two-storey wide frontage houses to two-storey narrow frontage houses, and then also a lot of three-storey houses, and as we've seen, the four-storey house of the Dolan family home. The two-storey houses generally are on the south crescent and the north crescent, which is this side. The terrace behind me, Mount Pleasant Terrace North, was the last side to be built. It's a straight terrace and it backs onto the half-mile lane, which is now Mount Pleasant Avenue. Here you can see that most of the houses in this side are three-storey houses. So they're 3 stories on smaller plots. So density was increasing as we go around the square. The first ones, the wide fronted houses, were very low density, wide frontage on big plots. As we continue around the square, Mr. Dolan was building more houses, narrower plots, and finally on the last side, he was building 3-storey houses primarily. So the house plans for these houses are pretty much the same, although they vary slightly depending on the plot shape. But generally the wide frontage houses have a reception room on either side of a hall and staircase. They're very brightly lit from front and back, and they are basically residential on the ground and bedrooms upstairs, and then kitchens and service areas in the basement area. Similar for the narrow frontage houses. These are more like the traditional city houses with a room front and back on the ground floor, and then a similar bedroom arrangement upstairs. The houses on Mount Pleasant Square are built very simply. There's no complicated construction involved in them really. The ground floor basement areas are built with calc limestone, which is a very common stone in the Dublin area and was widely available. And then from basement level up, they're built in brick. And the brick that you see here in these houses is a handmade brick, which is what we could call a local County Dublin stock brick. So brickmaking was banned in the city in 1779. And that led to an expansion in brickmaking around the perimeter of the city, and in particular along the canal route, particularly the Grand Canal. And so there was a lot of brick made in the Clondalkin and Newlands area of the city, and that brick is the kind of brick that you find used in buildings of this period here in Dublin. Because the square was constructed between 1800 and about 1830, as you go around the square you'll see that there are quite a few stylistic differences in the detailing, particularly of the front doors. And these are worthy of attention because there are some very fine fanlight details around the square, and a lot of original crown glass survives in the fanlight areas because these tend to be less interfered with as a general rule than the main windows. So you will see from the south crescent, where the first houses that were built have limestone surrounds to their door cases, and they have a very simple fanlight. As you go around the square, there is more decoration in the fanlights, and you can see in some of the later ones that they are quite intricate, and these were done with metalwork and are very fine. In terms of the Dolan family ownership issue, they retained ownership of the central open space right up until 1947. And at that stage, the tennis club had founded itself in 1893, and they made a business arrangement with the surviving Dolan family widow to buy the central park, and that was done in 1947. There were some mutterings about development in the central space after that, from around the 1950s onwards, but it wasn't until the 1960s that the land, a piece of the land, was actually sold by Mount Pleasant Lawn Tennis Club for sale to a developer for the construction of a petrol station on the Ranelagh Road end of the site. That planning application was passed by Dublin Corporation, and there was huge outcry about it and a lot of local protest, particularly from the local residents, obviously, and from Deirdre Kelly, who would have been a great campaigner in this area for this part of the city. And in a very unusual move, Dublin Corporation revoked the planning permission, which meant that they had to pay compensation to Mount Pleasant Lawn Tennis Club and the developer. And so the fact that we have a section of public park at the front end of the square today on Ranelagh Road lies with the fact that the corporation were forced to buy back that land, and they were committed to making it a public park for the rest of its time.
This lovely church, Holy Trinity Church, Rathmines, was built in 1828, and when it was built, it was on its own with a lane going up, or a wide lane going up towards the main Rathmines Road, which was beginning to develop at the time, and that was what the church was built for. Now it's surrounded by houses and cars and all kinds of activity, but at the time it stood on a little island with a tributary of the River Swan going around it, and the River Swan was about to go down into Belgrave Square and various other places, running down the hills. Now it's quite a different scenario, and it wasn't until 1847, when the township was started, that the real building began around here. The 19th century was full of dramatic changes, particularly the Act of Union, where the Parliament went off to London. So people who were wealthy as a result of the parliamentarians here and all their civil servants began to have to look for new business away from things like hatting and gloving and shoemaking. And a lot of them went into building. And in 1829 you had Catholic emancipation, so the Catholics were now more able to get into business. So profiles are changing rapidly. Also, when you get to the famine years particularly, the country is going into dissolution thanks to the fact that the landlords can't manage and thousands, millions of people are starving to death. Many of them came to Dublin, and that made Dublin very difficult to manage also. So these people who were ready to set up something new were mostly developers and builders, and under an Act of Parliament, the 1847 Township Act was set up, and that meant that in the township, the Rathmines Township starting it, that you could collect rates, and under the rates you could provide services to builders. So services included paving and lighting and sewage and water and so on. And this township did the extraordinary thing of building Boher na Brina to have water for their area specifically. So again, this was all empty in the early part of the century until the 1840s. And in the 1840s, when they started the township, people began buying plots of land from people like Lord Meath and Lord Palmerston, and on the plots of land they would either build themselves or lease it to other builders. So now you had ground rents coming in and you had house rentals coming in, and that's what started this whole extraordinary business. Now, the lamppost here is very important because in the 1850s, when these houses began to be built, this was one of the first roads around here, the residents were very upset by the fact that at night it was pitch dark. Nothing at all in the area, no shops, no anything. And they complained to the commissioners, and after a lot of rowing and a lot of arguing, they managed to get a lamppost put in exactly this spot. So this lamppost represents its predecessor from 1850. And of course at that time it was gas lamping, and in Dublin city they had gas lamps all over the place. Now, part of the point of the thing was that the rates here were lower, so people came, they were attracted by that to build on the land. And the biggest thing to take into account is that most of the houses were built for rental, not for the people themselves. Sometimes you get a pair of houses, one for the owner and the other for rental, but that's essentially all of these beautiful houses were intended for people to rent. So you get people moving quite a lot from one area to another. You can find the same extraordinary person living now in Rathmines, now in Donnybrook, and so on. One of the ways to get into business in the 19th century was to marry a woman who had money. And Patrick Plunkett, who I have to confess was my great-great-grandfather, did exactly that. He came up from Meath when the family farm fell apart in the famine, and he was one of 14 children. He came to Dublin looking for his fortune, married Elizabeth Noble, who had 2 shops, and then with a mortgage from Patrick Cranny, who was married to her cousin, he set up his own building business after working with a contractor for a couple of years. And his first houses that he built were these 3 here, but he commissioned Edward H. Carson to be the architect for the 3 houses. Carson was a very fine architect, but very dodgy with money, and Plunkett sacked him after the building of the 3 houses because he wasn't happy with the books, and he went on to build on his own. And behind us here are 4 beautiful houses by Carson. He built later on in the 60s, and over there where the modern apartments are was another of Carson's beautiful 2-storey houses. They're the villas type, which are particular to Dublin. It's a design where you go in upstairs and bedrooms can be downstairs. This terrace of houses from number 6 to number 13 Belgrave Road were responsible for it being called the Rebel Road because of all the people who lived in it. This was Pat Plunkett's first personal building exercise. He was the contractor and the builder here, and I'm pretty sure that he did it from pattern books, which was very common because he wouldn't have had, he wasn't a designer per se. And in the pattern books you made the choices yourself of what style of house you were going to have and what the details were going to be. So for instance, this type of railing turns up all the time, which means he probably bought it by the yard from mass production. And the same for plasterwork. They all have nice ceiling roses. They're all the same. And all the plasterwork is the same in every house. And it's the same in all his bigger houses. It's similar. So here we have number 7, the second house in, Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, the widow of Frank Sheehy Skeffington. They were both pacifists. And he, of course, was killed during the Rising for trying to prevent people from looting by a lunatic sergeant from the English Army. She was an extraordinary person. She was a teacher of languages, and she worked very hard all her life for female activism and for the education of women. In number 8 you had the Bros, who were wonderful monumental sculptors. Unfortunately he died of the diseases you get from stony work. And then in number 9 you get a most extraordinary woman. Kathleen Lynn was one of the first women to qualify in medicine in Ireland, and she did it by qualifying on an external degree in the Royal University. She became registrar of the Eye and Ear Hospital, and at this more or less at the same time moved in here to number 9, of course as a tenant. All these people are tenants, not owners. So the owner remains Patrick Plunkett for a long time. So these people are renting on a very long basis. She had her practice in the basement, as far as we know, and her great friend Madeleine French Mullen, they were probably partners, moved in with her, and they both started St Ultan's Hospital for Children, and it might have been the first hospital for infants anywhere. So it was an extraordinary thing to do. They were also the first people to bring in the BCG inoculation against tuberculosis. So they're adventurous and clever and hard-working women. And Kathleen Lynn lived here from 1903 until 1955. In the next house, in number 10, you had Robert Brennan and Una Brennan and Maeve Brennan, the writer, when she was a child. They lived here. And of course the place was raided by the Black and Tans regularly because he was a known member of Sinn Féin. At one stage he had to stay away, and the Black and Tans came and stayed all night with mother and the child, and Maeve was only something like 3 at the time, and I think it was a long lifetime trauma for her. At one stage my grandmother also lived here, so there was a lot of transience, a lot of coming and going. '11 and 12, I don't know anything about who lived there, and I think they must have been very uneasy at having all these activists around them. Kathleen Lynn was also a very strong Protestant. Her father was a Protestant clergyman in Mayo, and she used to go to communion at 7:30 every morning in Holy Trinity Church that we were looking at earlier. She was also, I should have said, she was she was a great friend of Connolly's, and she was out in 1916, and she took the surrender of the group that she was in because the leader of the group had just been shot, and the English soldiers didn't know whether they were allowed to take a surrender from a woman in military circumstances. But she survived all that, and in 1918, when the flu broke out, the Lord Mayor of Dublin released her from jail, or got her released from jail, in order to treat the flu patients. Now, when these houses were being built, large panes of glass were very, very expensive. And it was only in the 1840s that it began to be possible to put them in at all. So with a lot of them you see, and all over the area you see this, large pane glasses usually on the good floor where you'd have the drawing room or whatever. And on the bedroom floors very often either just 4 panes or small pane like on a Georgian house. So you get that with these ones and a lot of ones around the corner here. The other thing about this terrace of houses from number 6 to 13 is that they stayed in the Plunkett family, and oddly enough they were part of the marriage settlement when Pat Plunkett's son got married to Pat Cranny's daughter, and so they got number 6 to 13 here, and they got number 13 to 39 Marlborough Road, in 15 or 16 houses, 3 farms in Clare, and a house in Fitzwilliam Street which was suitable for a gentleman was the marriage settlement. So you can imagine what a way that was to start. And that of course was their income, was all those houses. They were let out. Also ground leases and back lanes also brought in money. So it was a little empire, and in a very short time. Here in number 13, my grandparents moved in on the day after they got married. They got married on Easter Sunday, 1916. And stayed in the hotel in O'Connell Street watching the beginning of the rising, and then they were told to go on home. They got orders from her brother, who was Joseph Plunkett, who was about to be shot in the rising. So they came back here to make gun cotton in the Bath, and when the rising finished and it got to the beginning of May and nobody knew anything, you didn't have radio or television or any method of communication. Even the papers didn't really know anything. They had to guess a lot. And on the 3rd of May, Muriel MacDonough, who lived down in Ranelagh on Oakley Road, came to the gate, and my grandmother came out to see her, and Muriel told her that Tomás had been shot that day and that Joe Plunkett was to be shot the next day. And the general feeling of how difficult it was to get real information and to know what was going to happen to your relatives. 8 of the 9 Plunketts were jailed between 1916 and 1923, hence the Rebel Road. Now, Patrick Plunkett and Patrick Cranny were, as I said, were married to first cousins, and Cranny had given Plunkett the first mortgage to start building. But in fact, Cranny started building at the same time. He had an outstanding shoe shop on Georgia Street, and mechanisation was on the cards, so he didn't want to get into that, so he got into building instead. And he built at least 6 of the houses on the other side of this Belgrave Road here, and he built it on the land belonging to Frederick Stokes, who was the founder really of the Rathmines township, which was really only a collective of developers and builders. And Cranny's houses are a little bit plainer, a little bit more ordinary, but he then moved from here. He didn't build around here anymore. He went on down to build in Ballsbridge and Donnybrook and on beautiful roads, and he then became affiliated to the Pembroke township, whereas Plunkett stayed here and argued with the Rathmines township. The 6 houses behind me are the 6 that Patrick Plunkett built when he started building this road. And on the 1862 and 1865 maps, there's only those 6 houses, and then just fields, empty fields. He bought this site, he bought a huge site, the site in effect of the whole road up to Cooper Road, and it contains now altogether 86 houses. So many of them were let to other builders, to other developers, but he built himself several houses in different places, sometimes a group of houses, sometimes one. But these are the first 6, and he bought the land from Lord Palmerston, who was the Prime Minister in England and Minister of War and so on. But Palmerston rarely came to Ireland, and one of the things he had done was, in the famine, he had sent everybody off his land, threw out all his tenants because they were now impoverished and couldn't pay their rents. After 17, a man called Regan was the builder all the way up to the crossroads. And then you get a mixture of people coming down here, and behind here are houses built by the Becketts, who were the granduncles of Samuel Beckett. And they built beautiful houses. They were also the builders of the museum building and what was the College of Art in Kildare Street. Really beautiful houses. They look the same on the outside as the others, but inside the interiors are lovely. You get then various people. I think Carson built on part of it. Plunkett built on some on this side. So it's all very, very mixed up, and all the leases show that it's going to people as builders, but you don't know where it's going after that. Patrick Plunkett settled himself in number 14. By then he had a different wife. The first wife died, the one who had started the business, so to speak, and he was now married to yet another first cousin of all the first cousins. And he lived there until he died at the age of 98. And in 1915, one of his sons from the second family went off to the war and was dead in less than 2 weeks. He was an officer at Gallipoli. In 1916, his grandson, Joseph Plunkett, was shot in the 1916 rising in the executions in Kilmainham. And Mervyn Wall, who was the director of the Arts Council for a long time and also wrote books, Fursey and so on, remembered Pat Plunkett out on the road stopping the cars in 1916 to tell people what had happened to Joe Plunkett. The tram used to come all the way down the middle of the road. They came very close together right in the middle. You had to be careful when you got off in case you got off into a car. And the houses are all subtle, different designs. When you look from one roof to another, if the roof changes, it's usually an indication that it's a different builder. So you can see those changes all the way along the road. And it attracted as tenants extraordinary people. So you had 2 Taoiseachs, you had Garrett Fitzgerald and Sean Lemass lived on this, Lord Mayor Alfie Byrne. You had W.E. Yeats' wife George in number 46. And she had the 2 sisters, Lily and Lolly, had the Coola Press, which was beautiful handmade books, in the basement. So it was a road that attracted quite extraordinary people. Also Fanny Beckett, who was one of the Becketts and a painter. Moira Barry, who was a painter of beautiful flower paintings. And in the large house just up here on the corner, Florence Stoker, that was Bram Stoker's wife. In other words, Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula, his wife lived here on the road. So it was a road that brought in extraordinary people, sometimes for a short time, sometimes for their whole lives. And it's still working as an extraordinary road.
Before the 1840s, this whole area was composed of fields. There was a river running through what is now Belgrave Square, a tributary of the Swan, but very few houses. There were some houses on Rathmines Road, and indeed there were some houses at the bottom of Castlewood Avenue. One of those houses was to become the home of John Holmes. John Holmes was a member of the Rathmines Town Commission for over 30 years. The Rathmines Town Commission was formed in 1847, and several of the commissioners either lived or developed houses round Belgrave Square. The first developer was John Jones. In 1842, he leased land from John Twigg on the northern side of the square. At that time, it was called Kensington Terrace. He built about 10 houses there. Subsequently, he disposed of 5 of them, but he kept the other 5. He died in 1879. He had married a widow called Mary Church, who had 3 daughters. And when he died, they had 5 of the houses, and they lived in one of them, number 57. And in fact, the Church daughters lived there until the 1950s. John Jones continued to acquire land in the Belgrave Square area. In 1844, he leased more land from Twigg. This land comprised the bottom 2/3 of Belgrave Square, or the northern 2/3 of Belgrave Square, which is now Belgrave Square. At that time, what is now Belgrave Square was a very large field with the river running through it. The ground to the north belonged to Twigg, and the ground to the south, the smaller portion, about roughly 1/3, belonged to the Earl of Meath. So in 1844, John Twigg bought the ground that is now the northern end of Belgrave Square, and he also bought sites on the west side of Belgrave Square. He bought, on the site on the west side, he built 4 houses. He actually had 6 sites, described as building plots. But in the end, he built these 4 houses. And if you look, they are identical to the houses on the northern side. Life wasn't easy for the people who came to Belgrave Square originally. For example, in about 1850, a man who lived in what was then actually number 2 Kensington Place. Again, these houses were called Kensington Place, not Belgrave Square. But in number 2 Kensington Place, at any rate, he petitioned Rathmines Town Commission to have a sewer at the back of the house, in the lane at the back of the house. But this was refused because it would be too expensive. So, you know, you're left to imagine what happened then. Actually, that is one of the reasons that in Mary Daly's book, she says that there were squares was because the night soil was kept in what was the back garden, at the end of the back garden, and that so that people could walk in the fresh air, they needed the square. So that's the end of John Jones' involvement. So now we move over to the east side. The next side of the square to be developed is the east side. This road is part of the old Milltown path, which led from the city to Milltown. At the beginning, it was just called the Milltown Path, but then it was later called Collinswood Road, and then it was called Belgrave Road. Another of the Rathmines Town commissioners, Graves Holbrook, owned the land along this side. He built the first 4 houses on this side, but he sold the rest of the land on the east side to a man called Hugh Morrison. Hugh Morrison was one of the most important people in the development of Belgrave Square. He was a hatter. He had premises in Castle Street and also in Westmoreland Street. So he built the houses number 7 to 19. He also built some houses which I'll talk about later on the south and a few on the west side. As each of his daughters married, he settled 1 or 2 houses on them. One daughter called Martha did not marry, and he left number 7 and 8 to her under the condition that if she were to marry, her husband was not to have any rights to any of the rents or property in that. So Hugh Morrison himself lived in number 7. As I think I mentioned, he was also a Rathmines Town Commissioner. That more or less completed the building on the east side, but in 1911 the Holy Trinity Church built a parochial hall in the corner, and which was used for many parish-related activities. But it was finally demolished in, I think it was the 1970s, and there is now a large apartment block and some townhouses in the back. Hugh Morrison next turned his attention to the south side of the square. It still wasn't called Belgrave Square, in fact. He sublet some of this terrace to a man called Henry Peat, but he built some houses on it as well. In fact, in one of his petitions to the Rathmines Town Commission, he says he has built 3 houses on the south side, and he now asks them to allow it to be called Belgrave Square. There had been an amount of public discussion about the commission taking over the square, because in 1852 they had taken over Harrods Cross Green, and they were also responsible for Palmerston Park. But it is actually not sure that they ever took responsibility for Belgrave Square. But in 1856 they finally granted permission to call it Belgrave Square. From very early on, the very first houses that we were talking about, Kensington Terrace and Kensington Place, if you think about it, Kensington Place was built at right angles to Kensington Terrace. So it was always really thought of as a square from the very word go. And in a lease of the 1850s, there is a sentence which says, in this area, which is intended to be a square. So we can thank Hugh Morrison for getting permission for this being finally called Belgrave Square. Besides developing on this side here, he also built 4 or 5 houses in that little cul-de-sac there, which is Belgrave Place. One of his daughters lived in one of those houses. He also built the 2 houses which are now we're back on the west side of the square, and he built these 2 rather fine houses at the top of the west side of the square. So if you think about it, Hugh Morrison alone owned, I don't know, I'd say nearly half the houses on the square. So we had these 2 houses, and then there was very little until we meet up again with Kensington Place. If you look at Belgrave Square today, you may notice that the top half has got a different wall treatment to the northern part. This part, the southern part, belonged to the Earl of Meath. The northern part originally belonged to John Twigg, but then he leased it to John Jones. John Jones ultimately leased it to John Holmes. Hugh Morrison had a lease on it from the Earl of Meath, which he also subsequently sublet to John Holmes. By the 1870s, John Holmes was the landlord of the whole of Belgrave Square. And apparently it was used by high school for their sports field. High school was what's called an Erasmus Smith School, and at that time it was in Harcourt Street. But they had no playing fields there at all. So they came up to Belgrave Square and they played cricket and rugby and tennis and athletics. In 1895, John Holmes Jr. offered Belgrave Square for sale to the high school. They said they were most willing purchasers. The price he asked for was £175, which he pointed out hardly paid for the expense he had been put to maintaining it, and also he had built a small pavilion on it. It was both a pavilion for the sports and it was also a caretaker's residence. So high school were very happy to buy it because they had been using it. High school stayed in Belgrave Square for over 70 years, and then they moved up to their present premises in Rathgar. However, the Diocesan School for Girls then decided to buy Belgrave Square, although they had misgivings about the drainage, but they were hopeful that they could deal with that as time went on. So they bought the square, and they said it was their proudest day when they had their sports day here in the square. The square was officially opened by Mrs. Sims, the wife of the Archbishop of Dublin. And the Diocesan School for Girls stayed here for 10 years, but then they too moved up to Rathgar and amalgamated with high school. During the winter, the grass was maintained. There was a flock of sheep on the square during the winter, and there was also a caretaker. The Diocesan School for Girls complained about trespassers, and the people who lived on the square at that time told me that they were never allowed into the square, but sometimes the children did sort of sneak in, and there was a watchman, the caretaker, whom they called Whitey, but they in a way they did it to get a chase from him, but they were sort of half afraid of him. When the Diocesan School for Girls left, the residents began to suspect that the square was going to be put up for sale. And one of the residents, Dr. Roy Johnston, organised a public meeting in what was the old National School. It's now the Rathmines and Rathgar premises. And a lot of people attended this meeting, and the decision was to ask the corporation to buy the square for the citizens of Dublin. They approached the corporation, and the corporation seemed willing enough, but actually did nothing. So 2 years later, the residents, they were meeting constantly, and 2 years later the residents met again, and this time the meeting was a bit more fiery, I suppose, and one of the suggestions was that they would ask the corporation to put a compulsory purchase order on the square. But the residents actually didn't really want to go that far. They felt that they would much prefer to have an amicable solution. And I think it was Dr. Buchanan was the Archbishop of Dublin at the time, and he would also, he also wanted, he would prefer to sell the square to the corporation. So the residents then mounted a campaign. And one of the most dramatic things they did was, one Saturday morning, they set up tables around the square and asked people to sign a petition to keep the square open for the public. So they got hundreds and thousands of signatures, which they subsequently presented to Mr. Tully, the Minister for Local Government. Two of the people who helped as well, who were great supporters of this campaign, were Carmen Sita Hederman, who was a member of Dublin Corporation, and also Rory Quinn, who was a TD. So finally, in 1975, the corporation bought Belgrave Square for £7,500 from the Dublin Diocesan Board for Dublin and Kildare. And the aim was obviously to keep the square open for the public, to have a green space, as they said, for young and old. So the square was actually in quite bad repair at that time, and the corporation had very little money. So they had plans, they put forward several plans. Several suggestions were made for what they could use the square for. One was, I remember, a putting green. Another was not to have any playground or anything like that. It was all just to be green and so on. But in the end, the corporation decided on a mixture of, sort of hard surfaces where children could play, and also then some shrubbery and greenery round. So the corporation have been maintaining the square for it's 50 years now, really, or almost 50 years. And the recent addition has been a big extension of the playground. And the absolute star of the show here now is a pirate ship. So the residents of Rathmines and surrounding areas, and in fact many places, are very thankful that the residents in the 1970s mounted that campaign and secured Belgrave Square for all of us.